Chapter 4 of A New You. April. The room dipped with buds of a sick pale green. She had ordered them from a nursery and dipped them in shellac. And finally, Rob had written back. At first she thought she must have been hallucinating his response, because the fumes from the shellac were so heavy that they made her dizzy as she dipped each bud again and again until they were so thickly coated that they'd been preserved unbloomed forever. But no matter how many times she touched the screen of her computer, his email note remained. He told her that her work was cool and that he was currently working on a project with his Robbots that brought him to Takoyaki for weeks at a time. And that he'd taken so long to get back to her because email access was spotty over there. He told her he was collaborating with some guys at a nanorobotics lab, and they'd created some tiny little robots that could move atop a canvas and squirt paint just like the larger robots. And she should drop by his opening next week and say hi. He'd invited her to an opening, but how was she supposed to attend? She went to his website and saw that he'd finally updated it, and that the opening of Nanorobots was in less than a week. Hadn't he read that her project on her website? Didn't he realize that the whole point that was that she was living inside her art for an entire year? Perhaps he thought that she was just putting on some sort of show, maybe even that she was computer generated or a robot herself. But he'd written her back, and this changed everything. A voice responding to her own, an invitation, even. She felt so confident and giddy that she stayed awake for days, dipping those tiny green buds into shellac and hanging them on every surface of the room. As she worked, she ruminated about Rob's note, and whether he was interested in her, and how she could tell him that he'd misunderstood her project without hurting his feelings, and how she could tell him that she couldn't go to his opening without him thinking that she wasn't interested in him, and why he didn't have email access in Takoyaki, and why he wanted his robots to be so small. She dipped and composed a note inside her head, and then when she had encrusted every surface of the room with lacquered buds, she stood back and imagined that she was in a garden, and delighted in the fact that she got to look at all this greenery without the risk of allergies or bugs. She'd carefully controlled the placement of the buds, some a darker green and some lighter, so that the overall effect was of a pollinous grid surrounding her. Satisfied with her latest creation, she staggered into the cube and collapsed onto the soft part of the floor, too exhausted to find her sleep mask or to rid her fingers of shellac. She woke up screaming to a spider, her fingers too stiff to move. It had crawled onto her arm while she slept, and she felt the tickling and flung it off across the room. It was fat and black and had thick legs, and her first instinct was to dash out of the cube. But she couldn't do that because she hadn't made herself presentable yet. And what if Rob saw her, and the spider was moving frantic towards her, and she looked for something to kill it with, and grabbed her computer, and brought it down hard upon the hideous moving thing. And she stood trembling in the corner and picked shellac off her fingers and breathed shallow and fast and tried to decide what to do. A sudden isolation seized her. She had broken her computer. She wasn't certain of it, which meant that she had no way to communicate with anybody. She could die inside her cube from inhalation of shellac fumes, and nobody would ever know. She picked her fingers miserable, and thought of sneaking out the trap door, which would surely anger the Grant people, or using the cameras to send a message, which would make her look like a fool. It would have to be the cameras, but how? Maybe she should go outside and hold an explanatory note up to a camera. Somebody from the company that gave her the grant would notice before too long, and they'd send her a new computer soon. Or she could even write a note, a plea to somebody watching to contact the grant people and tell them about the problem. She'd look ridiculous, but it would be okay. At worst. She'd have to wait a few days without a computer, and maybe it would actually be good for her to do without. To focus purely on her art. But what about Rob? Her next note to him was waiting fully formed inside her head, and she had to email him back soon or he might forget all about her. And she also had to check the comments on her website to see if people liked her latest work. And there was still a dead spider underneath her computer. And perhaps more live ones lurking all around. No doubt brought in among the buds. She tried to breathe deep. She got a tissue and lifted her computer, while squinting her eyes slightly so she didn't have to confront the crushed spider in full detail. And she opened her eyes wide and looked again, and didn't see the spider anywhere. And she realized that she'd brought down the computer upon the soft part of the floor, so the impact maybe wasn't that bad. But the spider seemed to have vanished despite the fact that she knew she'd put the computer down directly upon it. She imagined the soft floor substance absorbing the spider somehow, sucking it in, and eventually harboring hundreds of spiders, because surely there were more outside, just waiting to invade the cube. She grabbed a bar of darkest chocolate and ate the whole thing quickly while sitting in the corner of her cube and trying to clear her mind. Everything was fine. A nightmare, nothing more. The chocolate felt strong and soothing in her mouth. There might never have been a spider at all. Perhaps she'd simply been having a nightmare inspired by Rob's nanobots. She opened the computer delicately and pushed a button and was greeted with a healthy chime. The screen looked fine and the keyboard seemed to work, and everything looked intact. And she was so relieved that she stroked her computer and kissed it, and told it she was sorry for what had happened. But she'd had a terrible nightmare, and she'd never used it to try to kill a spider ever again. She put on her sleep mask and held the computer in her arms and fell asleep within seconds. It would be a good day. She awoke to find that a new press section had been added to her website, and somebody had written a glowing article about her. The article talked about her flowing auburn hair and full red lips and sexy legs and enigmatic artworks. It described how she was in a secret location with lots of cameras, but no telephone or microphones or visitors or natural light. There was a long paragraph about how her corporate sponsor had recently begun to support the arts because they were fervent believers in freedom of creative expression, even beyond the world of business. And they'd given her a lavish grant with an unlimited expense account that she could use for whatever she wanted. The article concluded by saying that it was anybody's guess what her next brilliant artwork would be, but it sure would be exciting to watch and see. She stared at the image of herself that accompanied the article, and she stared at herself in the mirror, and she stared at herself on her website, staring at the grid of lacquered green. She was finally being seen. There were now hundreds of praising comments, people telling her that she'd made a brilliant statement about the modern disconnect from nature, people telling her that she she'd made a brilliant statement about the puritanical fear of wildness. People telling her that she'd made a brilliant statement about the soullessness of contemporary architecture, and many, many people telling her that she should take off her clothes. She was disturbed by all the people who wanted to see her naked. This project was about her mind, not her body. But she was also secretly flattered by all those people finding her physically appealing. She'd never in her life gotten that sort of attention. She was rather shy and had never felt particularly attractive, and had always spent most of her time alone. Sure, she'd been obsessed with people before, but she had always acted too aloof for them to realize she was interested. And yet, here, inside the cube, something was changing. All these people watching her, but she was safe. She didn't actually have to talk to anybody face to face. No eye contact, no awkward conversation. Just a purest line of contact with the outside world. Yes, today would be a lovely day. There were no spiders in her cube, and her computer was working fine. And she must have picked all the shellac from her fingers because they were free. And Rob had finally written back, and her work was going wonderfully. Her only concern was the large bar of chocolate she'd eaten during her nervous fright. She was really trying hard to lose a bit of weight, but it was impossible to keep from eating candy all the time. She decided that she'd take the advice of eSlimming.com and write down the number of calories she was eating each day, and try to keep it under 1,000 until she was skinny enough. A little pad of paper and her favorite fountain pen and chocolate bar, $5.50, and she suddenly visualized an installation of a small round room with calorie lists spiraling down the walls. The handwriting would be girlish and bubbly, and the lists would be affixed with pushpins like dead butterflies, and the little pieces of paper would be in a near line spiraling down, around and down. And the lists would get progressively shorter, and the day totals less and less, until you had to crouch down to the floor to see the final series of notes, all blank. She thought about ending with a note that said, "Embalming fluid, 3 gallons," in a careless male hand, but then decided that such a note would be too obvious. Better to end with chillingly blank papers and then a bit of empty space on the wall. Maybe she shouldn't write down her calories after all. Instead, she'd just ignore her hunger calls. She was strong, and if she really needed to eat something, she'd just order a salad or some broth. She took off her clothes and stared at herself in the mirrors that lined most of the cube, and resolved to become as skinny as those women on Rob's website. If they could do it, she could do it. But her breasts still weren't very large. She searched online for breast enlargement products and read about pills and creams and electrical stimulators and strange plunger-like devices, and settled upon the least threatening looking option, a padded bra called the Abundance Curve, and that claimed to add 2 cup sizes and create deep cleavage while maintaining a natural-looking silhouette. She imagined Rob looking at her wearing the Abundance Curve, and she wrote back to him telling him that she'd attend his opening in an instant, but that her corporate sponsor would retract her grant if she left the room, and maybe she could visit virtually instead. All he'd have to do would be to put a camera onto one of his robots and put the video stream onto the web. And then she could enjoy his opening too, at least through a robot's eye view. And she told him that she was just fascinated by nanotechnology and his nano robots. Project made a brilliant utopian statement about the continuity of creativity from childhood to adulthood. Such a beautiful vision to have even the smallest creatures cavorting around and making art. She asked him how he'd gotten inspired to do this project, and told him that she'd created a new installation and that she'd love to know what he thought. The abundance curve was wonderful. She admired her new cleavage in a clingy black t-shirt with a deep v-neck, and wondered how she'd gone so long without looking like this. It was so easy, and such a transformation. She'd always seen images of women with breasts that went up and out, and never quite understood why she looked so different from them. But here she was, looking so sexy all of a sudden, and she felt so powerful and bold that she wanted to step out of her cube at once and show everybody her new form. Concealer and brick red lipstick and black eyeliner and a bit of lash lure mascara to make her lashes fat and black. And her control top stockings and the short black painted splattered skirt, and she stuck out her chest at her reflection and ran her fingers through her snakes of reddened hair. When she saw the green grid of lacquered buds surrounding her again, she startled and could only think of spiders. She stepped tentatively and looked around the buds for bits of black, and kept fleeing from seeing her outfit reflected in shellac. Sideways and over and his corner and that corner, and it was no use looking for spiders, because there was so many black flashes to distract her. A bud fell from the ceiling and stuck inside her hair, and she leapt when it landed on her. And it felt sticky in her hand, and then she began to rip the buds from every surface of the room. A frenzied tearing, and she gathered garlands in her arms and shoved clump after clump into the trapdoor until the room was bare and there was not a bud left anywhere. Back inside her cube, she scrutinized every surface of every object and concluded that there was absolutely nowhere for her spider to hide. She was safe, and she had rid the room of all those nasty buds. And perhaps she had even made a brilliant statement about the destruction of nature that would capture Rob's attention along with her abundance curve. She felt dizzy from hunger and sticky with shellac, and began to run the water for a bath. As she unstrapped the abundance curve, she noticed how freeing it felt to let her breasts fall naturally. And she saw that there were deep red lines around her torso and her shoulders where the elastic had cut into her skin. And when she peeled off the control top stocking, she saw another red line around her waist. And she remembered something she'd read about bras causing cancer because they prevented lymph from circulating underneath the arms. And she realized that she'd probably been wearing the abundance curve for far too many hours because she felt so tired. And there had been so many buds to pluck from the walls, and she climbed into the bathtub rather conflicted about it all. An entire installation destroyed because there might have been spiders, and a padded bra that made her look so beautiful, but she hated the way it constricted her. Excuse me. And what if it caused cancer? And she'd gotten this long without wearing a bra most of the time. And why should she have to hide behind padding? But why shouldn't she look as sexy as those women on Rob's website? And why was she getting so fixated on him? And why had she suddenly torn the installation down? She shaved her legs and underneath her arms and up her bikini line and tried to figure out what she was doing in this place. She remembered a garden where she had gone when she was very young, with shallow ponds covered by enormous lily pads that were turned up at the edges and looked so solid that you could sit on them without sinking. She had always wanted to jump onto a leaf and feel herself floating on the soft, sun-warmed surface, but her parents always held her back, and by the time she was old enough to resist their grip, the garden had been destroyed to make room for a shopping arcade. There weren't any lily pads at the shopping arcade, but there was a fountain inside where people used to throw coins, and she would stare at the coins covering the bottom and wonder what happened to wishes. Maybe this installation had been a last farewell to nature, a way of controlling it, and controlling it until it wasn't even possible anymore. Yes, she was done with nature, and from now on it was back to paint. Oh, she missed playing with color, smoothing brushes over canvas, making patterns with her hands. Those buds were entirely too much trouble, and they obscured her perfect gray ground. And she still didn't know exactly what had happened to the spider. She dried herself off and realized that she hadn't eaten anything since the candy bar, and she looked at herself in the mirrors and felt terribly fat, and vowed to eat nothing else until Rob emailed her back. She must have fallen asleep without meaning to, because she realized that she was laying down on the soft place, and she felt faint, and there were little sleep sections in the corners of her eyes. She grabbed a box of crackers and determined that she'd eat only one serving only. But then she'd eaten the entire serving, and she was still famished. So she ate a broken one, and then another broken one, until she'd eaten another complete serving. But she had to keep going, and the doughy taste of white flour enveloped her, and she decided that she'd finish the box and then eat nothing for a long time. Her reflection in the mirrors told her that she needed to tweeze her eyebrows again. They seemed to be growing back and thicker than before. But she needed to check her email and her comments first. She felt embarrassed that she'd torn her installation down, and she dreaded what people might say. An email from somebody at the grant company, and she was afraid to read it, but it turned out they were congratulating her. It seemed that the popularity of her site had skyrocketed of late. And another note from Rob. His tone was warmer, and he told her that he loved her idea of putting a camera on robots. But actually, he had a friend who was a cyborg who'd be recording the entire thing. All she had to do was go to his friend's website, and she could watch the opening through the eyes of Panacoto. He told her that her idea about the little robots symbolizing creativity in childhood was really great. And he'd have to use that idea if anyone asked him what nano robots was all about. But mainly, he'd made the robots so small because it seemed like a cool thing to do. He'd been tooling around Takokari, and a friend took him on a tour of nano robotics lab, and he just really liked the idea of making things so small. He had a cellular phone that was practically invisible, but you could still use it to surf the web. And he had a portable music player the size of a fly that could hold 1,001 days straight of music. And she shouldn't tell anybody about this, but he'd managed to get his hands on a prototype of a laptop computer so light that even a baby could lift it. Nanotechnology was where it was at, and since he wanted to get funding and all, he figured his artwork should be at the cutting edge of technology. And he loved her latest installation, Away with Nature. He told her that it was awesome that she'd gotten such a lavish grant, but didn't it get lonely in that little room? She couldn't abandon the abundance curve now, after she read and reread Rob's note, especially the final line about loneliness. She checked her comments and saw that there were more than ever before. People were lauding her for her bravery, for taking destruction as far as it could possibly go, for teaching an important lesson about the fleetingness of life, for putting on an incredible show. Though she'd gotten the usual slew of crude remarks about her appearance, a few few of the more personal comments were notable enough to set her thinking. One woman told her that she was playing a very dangerous game, tarting herself up to attract more viewers, and she ought to stop now and go back to her natural self before it was too late. But several other women told her that she looked so much more polished and sexy than when she'd begun, and that it was so inspiring to see someone who was artistically serious but not afraid to look like a woman. Her eyebrows loomed huge and unkempt in the magnifying mirror as she plucked them carefully and thought about what it meant to look like a woman. She'd always felt so inadequate compared to all those images of women she had seen on screens all her life. She assumed that other people had something she didn't, and that she would always be alone. But here she was all of a sudden with an image that commanded some attention, and she didn't see what was so inherently great about being natural. Evolutionary psychology even said that it was natural to try to make yourself look as sexy as possible in order to attract a mate. And it wasn't even like she was changing her appearance to please a man or anything. She was doing it for herself because of her own aesthetic imperative to create beauty. And what was wrong with wanting to look beautiful? Maybe nobody had taught her these secrets as she was growing up, but she could certainly learn now. She plucked a final hair and smoothed her perfect arches with a bit of tinted highbrow gel and smiled at herself. Panacopto's website was vast and deep, and she twisted a curl of hair around her fingers as she tried to find Rob's opening. It seemed that Panacotto had lived most of his life through a camera. He wore special glasses with a tiny video camera in front of one of his eyes, and he wore a portable computer on his stomach that remembered everything the camera saw and heard. He even had a video display projected directly onto his glasses so that he could check his email or surf the web or program his computer no matter where he went. His website was full of articles about his defiant attitudes towards corporate surveillance, his fervent need to preserve everything he saw, his constant quest to create the smallest life recorder possible. She looked at pictures from his archives, and most were of his hands and little metal parts. One section of the website contained a progression of images of Panacotto in full cyber gala over the past 30 years. The computers and cameras grew smaller and more streamlined over time, and his hair grew thinner and his posture more slumped. But his facial expression remained stunningly consistent. Mouth half open and dumb, and eyes were staring blank into cyberspace. An interviewer described how useful it was to live through a camera. He could review his footage any time if he forgot something. He could program his computer to remove unpleasant images like billboards from his visual field, and he could have his girlfriend tell him remotely which vegetables looked good if he were at the grocery store shopping for a meal. There was something endearing about Panacotto. He looked so vulnerable, with all those wires and computer parts strapped to his awkward body, and his mouth gaped so bewilderedly wide, and she was glad that he had somebody to hold him and to soothe his fear of dying. She felt terribly alone at that moment. She stopped reading Panacotto's site and went over to her favorite website, TimeTravelTrust.com, which allowed somebody to put money into a special trust fund so that when time travel finally became feasible, the money would have compounded into a sum large enough to cover the cost of being brought into the future. The site made no guarantees, but she had paid her money and received a certificate that declared her participation in the trust, and her name and address were in a database that could be preserved forever. The website was rarely updated, but she still loved to visit and reread the part that talked about how she could be brought into the future at any time during her life. She suddenly realized that she still hadn't found Rob's opening, so she went back to Panacoto's site and looked until she finally found the place where you could look through his eyes. The view through his camera showed the raw joists and pipes of an industrial loft ceiling, and she was jarred by the sound of snoring, and she realized that she had no idea what day or time it was, and that if she wanted to see Rob's opening, she would figure out this sort of thing before she missed it. She went to Rob's website to see when exactly the opening was, and she spent a while staring at his images. Oh, he was beautiful. Before she caught herself and established that his opening would be happening tomorrow at 8 o'clock in the evening, and that it was now after midnight, and she should really be trying to get some sleep. There was something reassuring about hearing Panacoto's snoring out from her computer beside her, and she thought that maybe the repetitive human sound would help her with her insomnia, which had gotten so bad that she could only fall asleep by staying awake until she collapsed. She seemed to alternate between long and futile attempts at sleep and hard involuntary naps. She'd often lie on her soft place for what felt like days, sleep mask on, ruminating about why she hadn't made more progress with her language of images and how glorious she'd look when she lost weight. And what would be like if Rob came and visited her. And sometimes a memory from the past would bubble into her head, and she'd have to push it away and try to relax by breathing deep and picturing soothing images. But her head was so stubborn these days, and she'd find herself replaying things. She didn't care to remember, and no matter how many times she tried to calm herself and use the Zen techniques of letting her thoughts flow into a river, the image of the river would soon dissolve and be replaced by ruminations again. She tried lying there and attempting to focus on Panacoto's gentle snoring, but she began to worry that she'd sleep so long that she'd miss the opening. So she set an alarm on her computer and tried to sleep again. But now she began to feel mocked by Panacoto, and the fact that he slept so easily, even with that camera apparatus on his head. And she decided that she had to do something about her insomnia, because she was getting terrible dark circles under her eyes that she couldn't cover up with even the most opaque concealer. She closed the window where Panacoto was still snoring, and she read on the web about all sorts of drugs and techniques, and concluded that a nightly dose of Lelaban would be the answer. It was supposed to put you to sleep softly and give you pleasant dreams, and wake you up after 8 solid hours with not even a hint of drowsiness the following day. She'd never liked taking drugs before, because she was so sensitive, and often found herself with dreadful side effects. But Lelaban was supposed to be different from the older sleeping pills, and clinical studies showed no side effects at all. She found a website called DrugsRUs.com that would send her Lelaban without a prescription. All she had to do was answer a short questionnaire and check a few waiver boxes, and a doctor would somehow approve her order and have it sent to her that very day. There were so many types of drugs available, and they were so easily acquired, and she decided to order Anorex as well. It was supposed to decrease hunger and increase fat metabolism, which was exactly what she needed. Some of the people who took Anorex seemed to experience nausea and depression, but she figured that was always uh, existentially nauseous anyway, and she could take an antidepressant if she got depressed. There were so many on the website to choose from. Questionnaire? No. She didn't have any allergies, and she wasn't taking any drugs. And she didn't have a heart problem or other medical problems that she knew of. Height and weight were easy to estimate, but what if they didn't think she weighed enough to qualify for Anorex? She added 100 pounds to her weight just in case, and clicked the order off, and decided to buy a scale to track her progress on the Anorex. There were scales that told you your body fat, and scales that spoke to you, and scales that told you how dehydrated you were, and scales that had a gypsy's face on top and prophesized your fortune for the day. And she was having trouble deciding when she noticed that she'd gotten a new email from the grant company. It was a short and friendly note, and it was just to say that maybe she didn't know about the full functionality of the cube. But if she stood with her feet aligned precisely on the footprints on the floor in front of the sink, a voice would announce her weight. She looked across the floor, and there were definitely some footprints that she hadn't seen before. They were rather subtle to see, matte, and the rest of the floor was glossy. But she didn't understand why she hadn't noticed them in all this time that she had been living there. And she certainly didn't understand why she'd gotten this email at the exact time when she was searching for a scale. Were the grant people monitoring her web surfing? She considered emailing the person back and asking about the timing of the note, but she felt somehow nervous and got up to stand on the footprints, and was so happy about the number announced by the booming robotic voice that she put the odd intrusion out of her mind, and thought about how Sliff-like she'd look during her next creative work. She lay down with her sleep mask on and tried to relax. But she was so excited by the prospect of seeing Rob in person that she kept imagining what his voice would sound like, and how he would move, and how she would email him after the opening, and tell him that it certainly did get lonely in her little room. Deep breathing and the river and fat spiders kept crawling in and making her shiver, and she suddenly remembered an installation called Seduction Couch that she had seen for years before. It was a black metal chassis in a black room with a sign that said, "Touching this couch will result in an electric shock." And she touched it, and yes, it hurt, but she found herself unable to stop. Oh, where was her sweet lullaby, and why wouldn't her mind settle down without it? She reached out for a sketchbook and a pencil for each hand, and found herself holding Milady's eyeliner in red and violet, and the rhythmic patterns began to shape themselves into page after page of trembling arabesques, and the pencils smooth, splendid, and she felt herself rocking as she followed the swooping lines into sleep. A chime from her computer, and she woke up at once. She went to Panacotta's website and opened up his viewing window and heard his voice, a thin monotone saying how he couldn't talk right now because he was at this art thing. And she saw a glowing urban street scene, and the sun was setting upon a river in the distance, and she was so excited that she kept on reaching out to touch the screen. It seemed that Panacotta was talking to his mother on the phone, and he was having trouble explaining what he was about to see. And eventually he told her that he loved her, and that he'd call her back tomorrow morning. As he stepped inside the gallery, she heard voices all around her, and she was struck by how immediate the experience felt. But she did not regret her choice to have no microphones. Her work was purer if she wasn't heard. It was dark inside the gallery, and people were crowded everywhere, in clumps, and she found herself moving quickly past everybody and staring at a platter of sugar cookies in the shape of robots. And Panacoto's hand selected several, and she began to hear him crunch. The cookies looked delicious, and she realized she was famished, but she didn't want to leave the screen even for a second, for fear that Rob would come. Plastic cups of wine, and then some gulping noises, and then a strained conversation with a short, wiry guy about whether the robot cookies had neural networks inside, and maybe they should have had chocolate chips inside, or maybe they should have had bites taken out of them. And the camera shook with choppy laughter, and she noticed that Panacoto's apparatus didn't seem to allow eye contact at all. The wiry guy was looking puzzled and slightly uncomfortable, and she imagined that she wouldn't like staring into a camera lens either. And the awkwardness was palatable, and she was glad that she was safe inside her little cube and not obligated to interact with anyone. And then she saw him. There was a stage lit up and lots of little robots being set up by scruffy assistants, and his voice was resonant and strong, and he moved with such intensity and Applebum? Applomb? He described the way his robots worked, and how he was so glad that everybody could make it to see his latest group, and how they'd learned to paint in really cool patterns, and they were like insects because they could carry around bottles of paint hundreds of times their weight. And she'd already read all about the theory behind his robots, so she mainly listened to the rich sounds of his voice and watched his body move. There was a wild quantity to him that was transfixing, and she kissed his image on the screen. Panacoto, unfortunately, seemed more interested in how the little robots moved. He made his way to the front of the crowd, just before the stage, and watched what felt like hours of the little machines skittering around to a loud soundtrack of techno music, and leaving behind traces of paint on the canvas below. Some of the robots looped wide and graceful, others crept linear and deliberate, and others moved fast and random, and swerved at the last moment to avoid collision. She was amused to notice that one little robot barely seemed to move at all, just stayed in one spot and occasionally turned a bit and sat atop a slowly growing puddle of yellow paint. She found herself getting restless and hoping that Panacoto would look at Rob, or even at the little wiry guy, or at some cookies or some wine. But Panacoto was mesmerized by the robots, and so she stared at that one still robot and imagined that it was terrified by the crowds and the commotion and the pressure to perform. And she imagined that it must have been mortified sitting in that spot all alone. Rob entered the frame for a moment to pick the little robot up. She followed Panacoto's gaze as Rob did something to the underside of the robot and put it down upon the yellow spot. And still, it barely moved, and the crowd laughed. And she felt so sorry for the little creature as the other robot swirled blithely around it. Blithely. Her head was suddenly taken by a memory of an ice skating lesson long ago with a group of children who all seemed to know how to skate already, and she had never skated before. And she could barely stay upright, and she kept on falling, and she was wet and cold and hurt, and the other children were skating smooth and confident and laughing at her as she clung to the wall and cried and the instructor kept telling her to push off, to glide, and she knew she'd fall, and her nose was running, but she needed her arms to balance, and she fell again, and hit her head, and she stared at the little robot on the yellow spot and tried to forget. The robots danced until their paint ran out, and kept on dancing till their batteries all died. Rob reached in and took the robots off the canvases, one by one, and lined them up at the front of the stage. And as he hung each canvas up on panels at the back of the stage with great bravado, she noticed that lone robot was still moving ever gently, subtly turning and shifting as if taking in the situation and wondering how to escape. The paintings looked abstract and rather random. The wheels had left behind and picked up so many traces of paint that the colors had muddied and blended gray-brown. She looked for the painting with the puddle of pure yellow and noticed that Rob had left it lying flat in the corner of the stage. She supposed that he didn't want the puddle dripping over the entire thing and onto the floor below. Rob was so poised and expressive as he apologized for the slight technical failure and thanked everyone for coming out. And everybody clapped and whistled, and he extended his arm down towards the line of robots in a dramatic sweep, with a mock humble expression as if to say, "No, no, it was all their doing." And the crowd laughed and clapped and whistled louder, and she could hear Panacoto clapping maniacally as the scene shook and shook before her. The platter of cookies was mostly empty, but Panacoto's hand went out to claim the last few broken ones, and then she startled at Rob's face as he was telling Panacoto that a special guest was looking through his camera lens, and he'd better behave himself and to not take too many of those cookies. She touched his cheek and on the screen as Panacoto said how good the cookies were, and Rob told him to tell Debbie how good they were, since she's the one who made them. And maybe he said Debbie or Nebby because the room was so loud. And they started talking about the techniques of the robots. And her head was tense and confused and frustrated, and she wanted to reach out to Rob and ask him who this cookie maker was. But maybe it was just his sister or a friend. And yet he'd actually mentioned his special guest and sent her a message. And she didn't know what was happening, and she was so overwhelmed, and she was staring at Rob as he was discussing the merits of nanotechnology with Panacoto, who seemed to be opening that he liked the bigger robots better. Opinioning, excuse me. I can't read today. Bigger robots better because they could hold more paint and make bolder designs. And she looked at Rob's lips and his eyes, and she was so drawn to him, and if only he could reach into the screen, and then a woman with a shrill voice screamed, "Rob!" And she was so happy to see him again, and she lunged and hugged him, and her nails were red and sharp, and Panacoto sighed, forlorn, and walked back to the crowds, and onto the glaring city dark. She closed her computer as Panacoto began to snore. The opening was over. She sent Rob a briefest email telling him that his opening was wonderful and that she couldn't stop thinking about that sad, immobile robot. And she did, in fact, get terribly lonely, but the solitude allowed her to live a pure existence because her work was untainted by the chaos of the outside world. And then she noticed that her package of drugs had been delivered through the trap door while she'd been staring at the screen. And she tore the wrappings open and took the Anorex and the Lullaban immediately. Yes, she'd only woken up several hours before, but she figured that the best way to get stabilized would be to take the Lilliband while it was nighttime outside, instead of waiting until she was tired. She lay down upon the soft place and felt her head sinking, and her thoughts became blurred, and she tried to fight the effects of the Lilliband just to see what would happen, but it was so strong that it wouldn't even let her obsess, and she fell asleep into visions of Persephone tumbling into the underworld. When she woke up, her head was hurting, and she felt dizzy and disjointed and sick. She crunched on some crackers as she tried to understand what she had seen inside her screen. Rob had spoken directly to her, and he was so compelling, and he had such an adoring audience. But who had made those cookies for him? She felt jealous and realized that no matter how bad she felt today, it was time to go outside the cube again and think about the progression of her work. She had been neglecting herself for Rob's opening, and she was in this room to be productive, not to focus on other people's art. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw that her eyes looked small and terrified without any liner or mascara, and she began to paint her face again, starting with the concealer, which she needed quite a bit of today because of her skin seemed to have more pimples than usual. And the circles underneath her eyes were terribly dark, and she followed the concealer with a patting of powder all over it like it said to do in Milady's book o' tips to help the concealer blend into the rest of the skin. And then a circling of blackest coal eyeliner and several coatings of mascara on her top and bottom lashes, and a dramatically arching Cupid's bow of burgundy lip liner to make sure her lips stayed sharp, and a layer of burgundy lipstick, and then a blotting, and then another layer for intensity, and a few brow hairs growing out that needed tweezing, and a few pulls and twinges in some gel to smooth them into place, and she looked at her face and felt seductive and glazed. On with the abundance curve and a low-cut t-shirt, pulled carefully over her perfect face, and she began to put on the control top stockings, when she noticed that her bikini line was covered with red spots, where she had shaved several days before. What if Rob were to come to her cube and see her skin like this? She sat down on the soft place and looked more carefully at the area, and saw that there seemed to be a dark spot in the middle of each welt of red. She remembered why she rarely shaved that area. Several times in her life she'd felt obligated to put on a swimsuit, and she'd always gotten ingrown hairs every time she shaved her upper thighs. She sighed and found a pin and bent her head down and went from follicle to follicle, pinching the skin around each welt and sticking the pin underneath the black spot and picking it out, freeing a little hair that had begun to grow into the skin. It was oddly satisfying to release the hairs from the sore spots, and some of them were deeply embedded, and she had to pick a bit with the pin to free them. And her skin started to bleed, and she swabbed it with peroxide and went systematically over both her inner thighs until she'd liberated every ingrown hair. The area was now a mess of inflammation, and her skin was stinging, and she knew that the places where she had to go deep to get the hairs out would take a long time to heal. And she thought of all the images of women she'd seen on screens with hairless bodies and the tiniest of bathing suits, and she cursed her sensitive skin and dabbed peroxide on her molted thighs. And if Rob could see her now, he'd probably be horrified. She searched on the web for a product to help her and ordered a bottle of Softly You solution, which promised to soothe the redness away and prevent ingrown hairs from ever happening again, and provide her nether regions with a lovely floral scent. It had been a long time since she'd been outside the cube, and she was horrified by what she saw. Gray walls splotched with pink where the paint came off. Globs of glue. She'd never have a smooth surface again. She cursed herself for putting up the buds and cursed herself for pulling them down, and grabbed a palette knife and began to pick the walls clean. And that's the end of that chapter. Thanks for watching, guys. Bye.